This is the Biz News Podcast, one-on-one conversations with experts in business and personal development.
Active duty military know they could be asked to put their lives on the line in times of armed conflict. But to see a steady loss of life during peacetime because of suicide, that's a problem a former Army officer says needs to be better addressed. Tara Fields resigned her commission as a captain with the Kansas National Guard after her efforts to get top brass to deal with the steady loss of lives through suicide fell essentially on deaf ears. Ms. Fields talks about the suicide problem and what could be done to solve it in this edition of Biz News Interviews. What has gotten you so involved in the crisis of the suicides of military personnel?
Well, after 12 years of honorable service, both in the National Guard in 3 different states and on active duty for 8 years, and serving as a mental health provider for 8 of those years, I unfortunately got to witness a lot of suicides and a lot of death investigations. And then my husband is currently still serving on active duty and is a senior leader in the military, in the Army. And we continue to see suicide rates climb despite efforts on many different levels that have not been impactful. And about 5 years ago, I decided that I needed to take the uniform off to speak out in ways that I knew I couldn't while wearing the uniform. And so after 12 years of honorable service, I resigned my commission to write and publish this book.
And the name of the book is?
Tracer Patient, a game changer to mental health across the military. Let's put up that here. It's not an easy read. It was really difficult to write. I, in not so many words, became the patient myself as a mental health provider in the Kansas National Guard. I'm a therapist and practitioner. And when I arrived to Kansas, I knew how negligent the Kansas National Guard was months, actually a year and a half before I arrived here. I was in the Virginia National Guard before arriving in Kansas, and Kansas happens to be my home state. And so coming home, my husband was able to get orders back to Kansas. But while we were in Virginia and I was serving in the Virginia National Guard, for lack of a better word, I was complaining about the state of the National Guard to my husband over lunch. And a very senior, it was a lieutenant colonel that approached the table and he said, "Hey, I've kind of overheard your conversation. And I happen to know the Fulberg Colonel at the National Guard Bureau. She's a great friend of mine that oversees all mental health assets." And I thought, well, this is quite interesting. And so lo and behold, that afternoon, I sent an email to this lady. And 3 days later, I happened to be going to Baltimore for a conference, and she gave me an hour and a half of her time at the Pentagon. And she kind of gave me the lay of the land of what was going on at the time legislatively, what they were trying to do in Washington to kind of move the needle, specifically in the National Guard with regards to mental health. And I was just so grateful for her time, but then motivated as ever to move the needle in the Kansas National Guard or in the Virginia National Guard at that time. But what she shared with me was that there was 4 states and territories. Of the 54 states and territories, there were 4 states that did not have full-time mental health assets in the National Guard. And Virginia and Kansas were 2 of the 4 states. And I thought, well, what's the odds of this? And so lo and behold, as gung-ho as I can be, I thought, well, then my days are numbered here in the Virginia National Guard, but at least I can pitch this to the leadership. So I prepared a 37-page PowerPoint presentation, presented it to the chief of staff, and they didn't want to fund it. And I was just baffled. I mean, I gave it to them on a silver platter to include how you fund these. I contacted other states that she shared with me were paving the way, and it just fell on deaf ears. So my days in the Virginia Guard were numbered. I said, well, I did what I could. I PCS, or actually in the Guard, it's called, it's a move, just like a move in the active component, but I interstate transferred to Kansas when my husband got orders to then Fort Leavenworth. And so coming back home, I figured, okay, I'm back home. I knew kind of that Kansas too was pulling up the caboose of the train, so to speak. And so when I got on the ground, within 4 months, we started seeing this cluster of suicides. And at one point, it was six suicides in 6 months in a state the size of, at that time, it was just over 7,000 troops.
Now we have to ask, are we finding out about these uh, suicides because of better reporting these days, or is something else going on?
I think people, quite frankly, are getting tired of things, so to speak, being swept under the rug. And for the last 5 years, I pretty much turned into an investigator. When I opted to take the uniform off, and I took this my initial story to the media. There was an article written in the Kansas one of the Kansas newspapers, the Topeka Capital Journal, and this article came out on the 6th of April. Happened to be the last day of my commission. I had resigned, and it was the last day of drill for me. And I asked the Capital Journal to withhold the article until I was out of drill because of the nature of the article. When that article came forward, I had over 30 people contacting me speaking of criminal things that were happening in the Kansas National Guard. And I said, what the heck is this? Things that would just baffle you. And so if I'm going to put my name to a story, I had to turn into an investigator and triangulate many people's stories to me in reportings. And so really the better part of the last 5 years, not only am I a therapist in private practice, and authoring this book and working diligently to get this book published, I've had people from contractors to civilians working in the system, and not just the Kansas National Guard. When that article came forward, it was just like the floodgates had opened in a lot of ways. And I'm thinking, how is this? This is things that I wouldn't even ever believe were happening right under our nose, right next to us. And so I knew I couldn't stop. I'm honestly deathly afraid of disclosing some of the things that I did in the book. But at the same time, our nation, look around. We have all allowed the stuff that's happening in this nation to happen. And it's time that we all start standing up and be part of the solution instead of the problem.
And what would that solution be?
It's time to stand up and speak up for what's right and wrong. I think we've gotten into a culture of complacency, and not just within, with regards to mental health. Look around: corruption, lack of accountability, in different entities and organizations across our government. And I love, and we need our government, but we've allowed these things, and there's very little accountability at very senior ranking positions in the military and otherwise. And, my concern, I've got 4 kids that are, let's see, almost 14, 12, 8, and 6. I refuse to allow this to be what's left to my children. So, this book, although it's so much of it is mental health in our military, there's a lot that speaks in, the latter part of the book about corruption and complacency, and that it's, and I'm trying to ignite some fury in positive ways so that people start standing up for their country, start standing up in their organizations and speaking up for what's right. Instead, we say, oh, that problem's too big for me, or, we've saw somebody else get their head chopped off, so to speak, for speaking up, or sent out of an organization, and been swept under the rug, but nothing changes. In fact, that's why we see in our nation right now, what's right is wrong and wrong is right. We've just flipped, on its end. There's a chapter in the book, my favorite by far. I call it the toxic 20% versus the exhausted and ill 80 percenters. Okay. The toxic 20% aren't the ones that are committing suicide. Okay. The toxic 20% are the ones that continue to step on everybody else in an organization. They make it to very senior ranks, and we might move them to another entity or cross laterally transfer them somewhere else because of things that they've done, but we don't want to get rid of them. And then the rest of us, 80% good people, want to go to work, do right by their morals, ethics, values. But they're looking over 20%. And in the military, not all leaders are toxic, but you got some guys that are building big ribbon racks for themselves, writing their own evaluations, but making themselves look awesome, writing this stuff on their forehead for everybody to see. Very egotistical folks, but nobody's holding them to account.
Now, Tara, we can't go a week without reading something about how wonderful our military is, most powerful in the world, has a budget that exceeds any rationality, many people would say, uh, touts its management skills, yada yada yada. Is that all false?
I would say that there are some awesome things happening in our military, and we absolutely have probably the best fighting force in the world. Okay. We are a powerhouse, but we're not even coming anywhere close to what we could possibly do. We are folding at the seams, and all you got to look at is one statistic: retention rates. Okay.
Oh, hang on, Tara.
Oh,
Occasionally we are losing your voice for some reason.
oh,
Whack that computer if you don't mind.
sorry about that.
That's okay. There you go. Let's try that answer again.
Okay, so what I was saying was it in our military, we're absolutely we have the best fighting force in the world. Okay, but we have a ways to go when it comes to taking care of our own. Look at one statistic: our retention rates and our recruitment rates. We are losing folks in droves because we're not taking care of the ones we got, and then we're sending people out for next to minuscule things. Okay, listen, we have soldiers that are coming in 18 to 25-year-olds that, first of all, their brains aren't fully developed. Okay. They're knuckleheads. They're going to make silly mistakes. But our force is tired. We've been at war for 22 years. Okay. And we've gotten away from the basic tenets of supervision, of leadership, of mentorship, of soldiering, that we as leaders, senior leaders, are just tired. Oh, they were late for information. Let's start a counseling packet. We got to get them out. They're not conforming. you know, Things that normally back in the 90s and 80s when we weren't in wartime, these are normal things that these leaders are going to put somebody under their wings and mentor them and take care of them and grow, quality soldiers. Now we live in a culture of immediacy. We want it right now. And we have been training, deploying, fighting, training, deploying, fighting for 22 years. You have careerists that have spent this time in the military and are tired. And so now we're losing folks due to burnout, but yet, Congress is setting all these mandates down. And I've talked with two-star generals in the last couple of weeks. They have all these do outs, but they don't have the manpower to do it. I've talked to hospital commanders that are sitting at 35% staffing, and they can't get providers in because it takes 5 months to bring on a new provider. And we wonder why these soldiers are dying in wait times. So I mean, we have to look at the systemic contributors to suicide.
And you do that in your book, I understand.
I do. I do. Yes, sir.
Now, before we go more into your book, I would like we have to describe this for our listeners, but of course our viewers will be able to see it. You know, two gentlemen in posters on the wall behind you. Would you describe them for our listeners and tell us why do you do that? Why are they there?
So let's start with who they are. So the gentleman in the Navy, Brandon Caserta, he was in the Navy for just 3 years, and he was an aspiring SEAL, Navy SEAL. His dad was a retired E9 in the Navy and actually was on recruiting duty before Brandon opted to join the Navy. And Brandon and a buddy from high school decided that they really wanted to go after Navy SEAL training, and they trained and trained and trained. This kid gets to Navy SEAL training, and he just tells you the heart of this kid. He had been running on a broken leg for over a week and had pneumonia in sight. And somebody, if you know much about Navy SEAL training, there's a bell, and you can opt to ring the bell to tap out and say, okay, I can't do this anymore. I quit. Somebody rang the bell for Brandon because of the excruciating pain that he was in. And Brandon refused. He said, I did not ring the bell. He refused to quit. Just tells you the heart of this kid. But he was rerouted to medical. They found all this, and now he gets reclassed, and now he gets shipped off to from California out to a unit in Norfolk, Virginia. And he he lands in probably the most toxic command climate I've ever heard about. And not just one or two leaders, nine leaders, okay, from all the way up the chain that the parents have disclosed. And for 2 years, this kid was berated, harassed, and he has to wait 2 years to go back to Navy SEAL training. So he had his heart set on being a Navy SEAL, going back, but he gets out there for 2 years, excuse me, and is berated, harassed, called a Bud's dud. But if you think of it, this and what Bud's training is what Navy SEAL training is called. And I don't know the acronym off the top of my head, but these are the things that he would be called. And the one really toxic leader closest to him had gone on a 6-month deployment out to sea. And Brandon thought, this is my opportunity. I need to get out of this command climate. And they just kept pulling him back in. Well, on the 25th of June, 2019 or 2018, after a week before having left 7 suicide notes to members of his command and leadership, he jumped into the rear rotor of a helicopter to his death. Okay, not once, but twice. He jumped the first time and it blew him back. The second time, he flung himself in and completed his task. I mean, I know that's very difficult to even, consume right now. He was not authorized to be on that flight deck. To this day, his parents still get voicemails, voices muzzled, telling his parents what happened on that flight deck. They were all given gag orders. And I can go more and more into depth on his story, and you can read about it. But just an atrocity. You can't even imagine something like that happening. And just 20 minutes before he flung himself into that rear rotor, his dad was on the phone with a command saying, dang it, if you're another very expletive word, but he said, dang it, if you're not going to take care of my son, I'm going to come get him. And so there was a 20-minute lag between that phone call and, him flinging himself into that rear rotor. And what people they've been able to kind of piece together is that they pulled him in and, called him all sorts of names and your daddy can't save you and all this stuff. And so he went up and he did what he set out to do that day.
What the heck kind of management is that?
Yes. And what is deeply troubling is that those leaders have been promoted. There's been nobody held to account. Just and we wonder why the state of our nation's military is bleeding troops. Because I'll tell you this, I love the Army. I loved my time in my military service. I would do it again, but I would tell you, the more veterans that I talk to these days are ashamed of their military service and wouldn't recruit their worst enemy to go into the military these days because of the state that we're in. And there's great people in our military. Again, take that 20 and 80%. We're talking 80% of awesome folks that are doing awesome every day, go to work, that are selfless, taking care of their job, their tasks. But you got 20% over here that have desecrated their morale. There's been no accountability. We're lucky to slap them on the wrist. We quietly retire them. We sweep them under the rug. And we wonder why now that 20% is 20, 30, and 40%. And
What's
now our
been
nation,
well? You have detailed a lot of this in your book. What has been the reaction? I would think outrage at the very least.
so the book has only been out for just about 2 months now. And so I've got very little feedback at this point. I've just started this media campaign. And I think had I published this book 2 years ago, you would have heard a very angry Tara Fields. And it's not that I'm not angry. I'm enraged. I mean, this should not be happening in the world's best military. We can do better. And so I don't headhunt my book. I don't go after political leaders. I don't call people out by name. In fact, you can apply this to just about any hierarchical organization that exists in this country.
Now, tell us the story about the other fellow on the wall behind you.
So this is Zachary Schaefer, and he was in the Kansas National Guard when I served in the Kansas National Guard, and is the number one reason why I am no longer in uniform. So the night that I became the patient was over this kid, in major part. But after 4 months, when I got to the Kansas National Guard and seeing kind of a very complacent bunch, and then starting a cluster of what would be at 6 and 6 months suicides. Schaefer's best friend was our second in a cluster of 3 in 3 weeks, kind of leading up to my hospitalization. But Zach Schaefer, the day that he spent all of July of 2018 in a drug rehab facility. He voluntarily disclosed that he had a drug problem, and asked for help. So he had just lost his technician job in the Guard, and he also lost his health insurance, which is another major difference across all components. Guardsmen and reservists have to pay for their health benefits, and so that's another thing that we can talk about later. But Schaefer, when he gets out of his drug rehab on the 29th, 30th of July, his best friend committed suicide the 31st. Okay. And Schaefer forgot about Camisa's birthday. And so when that happened, so Camise commits suicide on the 31st. And I met Schaefer on the 5th of August at the open casket for his buddy that had committed suicide. So I didn't know Schaefer until then. And we're sitting on the 5th of August. We're standing actually at the coffin, paying our respects. And I was in uniform and he was in civilian clothes. And I looked at Schaefer and I said, listen, I know you have a lot going on, but I want you to know that I said, use this language. I give two shits about the Army right now. I care a lot about you, and we need to make sure that you're not the next one. And he just kind of looked at me very, calling a spade, and just and having a very difficult conversation, obviously, while we're standing there. And Schaefer looked at me. He said, I appreciate that. And I said, I know you don't have insurance. We're going to find you care. We're going to get you taken care of. So I'm going to stop there for a minute. So the Kansas Guard, well, all across the Guard, okay, if these soldiers are not on active duty, okay, they fall under what's called Title 30 or Title 32 orders. They're on state orders. They're not full time. Okay, Title 10 gives them, they're on active orders at the national federal level. Okay, so two different orders. The Kansas National Guard had 8 mental health providers, okay, which is a plethora of assets when you're looking at just at that point about 7,200 soldiers. Okay, when I first got to Kansas, they were housing all of these medical providers in the medical detachment. And I'm thinking, why aren't we having these medical assets, these mental health providers attached to all these major units, building a rapport? This is what we do on active duty. You build a rapport with, your troops. They know where to go find you if they need you way before. So you're building these relationships way before they need care. That's the idea of embedded behavior health. So when I got to Kansas and I'm like, what are we doing? We have all these medical assets sitting back here doing periodic health assessments, which is every soldier every year has to go through an evaluation for medical, dental, mental health to make sure that they're still, capable of serving. But I'm thinking, why are we using all of these medical assets here instead of going out to these units, especially on the mental health side? And so I approached the colonel my second drill weekend, and he said, oh, Captain Fields, that's a great idea. And I'm thinking, this isn't Tara Fields' great idea, Ferry. This is military doctrine. This is Army doctrine. So anyway, he asked me to go ask these 7 providers, how many of them would be interested in being farmed out to these other units. Well, I don't mean to disparage military providers, because not all of them are this way, but sometimes we get prima donnas that don't want to go out to the Colby, middle of nowhere, Kansas. They want to stay in the Ritz every weekend and get paid. Okay. Which is a problem, because that's where we need to be. Okay. To eliminate barriers and red tape and decrease stigma and build relationships. But we're sitting here doing check the block periodic health assessments where many soldiers are going in saying, I don't want to say yes on that question because I'm going to be flagged. So we fly through it and go, no, 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 even though there's 3 questions on there that I should have answered yes to if I was truly honest. But we're worried about it getting reflected in our evaluations, being flagged, we're sidelined, can't carry our weapon. And so now we're creating more stigma based on the systemic ways that we address these things.
Tara, before we run out of time, and unfortunately we will shortly, can you give our listeners and viewers a website or some way they can get in contact with you or others?
Yeah, so I'm in private practice, and my practice website is www dot T4 letter T number 4 therapy therapy.org. And I do have a spot on there where you can learn more about Tracer Patient. I also have a GoFundMe. If you Google Tracer Patient, a game changer to mental health across the military, or Tracer Patient, it'll come up, which there's a lot of information on there. I'm also on Facebook, Tara Fields, lots of information on there. I'm constantly posting different things on Facebook, political and otherwise. I hate the politics game, but so much in everything that we're doing is rooted in policy.
And you should be happy we're headed into yet another presidential campaign.
Oh boy.
Maybe you can get somebody to actually sit down and listen to what you have to say.
Oh, well, that's the hope. Can I say one more thing on Zach Schaefer? So Zach Schaefer, when I said he's the reason why I resigned, so the night, and I'll just use this colorful language. I use it in the book. I said, the chapter of the book that I disclose what happened is the night I lost my shit for good reason, was over Schaefer. I had gone to my unit command that afternoon, very worried about Schaefer, because I talked to him from the 5th of August to the 13th every day. On the 13th, nothing. 14th, nothing. 15th, nothing. 16th, I said, okay, I went to my unit commander. I said, I've not heard from Schaefer in 3 days. I'm really worried about him. He's the highest risk soldier we have. I'm worried about him being the next suicide victim. I need his address. I'm prepared to go locate this kid. And my commander, who had lost 2 soldiers within the last 3 weeks, said, Tara, you're wasting your time. He's a dirtbag. We're just trying to get him out. Okay. I was livid. I told my commander, I said, I know he's not being a stellar soldier right now, but he is our soldier. And he told me he didn't have. So now Fields is holding the weight of this kid's life. I have no recourse. I can't call local law enforcement to go do a health and welfare check. I have no idea where to go locate this kid. And my command, who should have this information, doesn't. And so I'm holding this kid's life in the palm of my hands. Okay, that's true stress. Okay, I get in the hospital, day 2 of being in the hospital. I'm looking around. I'm looking at doctors, lawyers, dentists, architects, RNs. I said, I was baffled. But when you think about that, all of those professionals are holding in the palm of their hands on any given day people's lives. And then when we're working and operating in broken systems and holding the weight of that, you got good people that are succumbing to burnout and stress and overload and suicide. Okay, that ultimately cannot do that any longer. Okay, and this is why on a systemic level, we need system leaders saying, hey, whistleblower, thank you for highlighting this. And this is this and this and this with transparency is what we're doing to admonish that. Instead, they fired the whistleblower. Instead, they harassed the whistleblower. They try to get the whistleblower to be quiet.
You've been watching the Biz News Podcast. We welcome your input. Send your email to editor@biznews.com. Thanks for watching.